Welcome, everyone. My name is Madeline Fitzgerald, and I am the manager of adult programs here at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. On behalf of the museum, I would especially like to welcome and thank our members who are watching this evening. It is because of your generosity that our collection and special exhibitions are free and open to everyone. If you are not currently a member, I encourage you to join by visiting our website at cartermuseum.org. Though programming is occurring virtually, I want to mention that the Carter is open. We are continuing to operate at a limited capacity, and we require masks for everyone to enter the museum. If you haven't been to the Carter recently, I strongly recommend a visit. As a reminder, we have always been a no-touch environment. But tonight is the first lecture of this year's Experts Talk on the Carter series. In The Art of Nature, we are inspired by our immersive installation In the Night Garden by Natasha Bowdoin, and we'll be learning about two works in our collection that remind us of this temporary and transformative piece. We will hear from two experts in environmental science about the art of caring for and protecting nature, even when it goes awry, like Natasha Bowdoin's piece embraces. After their presentations, we'll do a Q&A session. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Zoom webinar format, you can submit a question by using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen or on the top if you're watching from an iPad. Feel free to submit questions throughout the program, and we will do our best to cover as many as we can at the end of the talk. If you have any questions or problems during the program, please use the chat function to reach out to me. I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat during the program, so I'm happy to help how I can. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing our guests tonight. First this evening, we will hear from Tiana Rehman, the collections manager of the Philecology Herbarium at the Botanical Research Institute of Texas in Fort Worth. As such, she facilitates the care, usage, and growth of this scientific plant collection, which houses 1.4 million specimens, making it the 10th largest herbarium in the United States. Tiana received a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science and a Bachelor of Art in Cultural Anthropology from Southern Methodist University, and her MS in Environmental Science from Texas Christian University. Tiana continues to be an active field botanist and has contributed specimens to the herbarium from floristics projects in Texas, Peru, Costa Rica, and Jamaica. Her current projects include the curation and digitization of herbarium specimens for 4 National Science Foundation grants covering the Texas, Oklahoma, and Philippines geographic specialties and the taxonomic specialties, including ferns, orchids, carnivorous plants, and others. And after Tiana, we will then hear from Rob Denkhaus. Rob holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Biology and Management from the University of Wisconsin. His career has involved wildlife research on common loons, greater prairie chickens, black bears, timber rattlesnakes, swamp rabbits, wild pigs, and American alligators. Environmental education in zoos and nature centers has taken him back to Ohio, where he grew up, in Indiana and Tennessee, with a short foray into Colorado before coming to Fort Worth in 1997. At the Fort Worth Nature Center and Refuge, Rob has held numerous positions, from teaching naturalist to education program supervisor to natural resource manager to his current position of Nature Center director. In addition to his Nature Center responsibilities, Rob is also an adjunct professor of environmental science at TCU, a research associate with BRIT, and former director of the Texas Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife, and chair of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Wildlife Diversity Advisory Committee. In addition, Rob holds certification as a licensed pesticide applicator, a prescribed burn manager, and a nuisance alligator control operator. Tiana and Rob, thank you both so much for joining us this evening to talk about your work in relation to objects in our collection. And like I said, Tiana is going to go first. So whenever you're ready to share your screen, we're ready.
All right, let's confirm that y'all can see my screen. Do you see that up there? Wonderful. Well, I'd like to start off first as I arrange my Zoom windows. I'd like to start off just by thanking you, Madeline, for having me here in the Amon Carter. I've had nothing but wonderful opportunities to work with the Carter, and this is just the latest one in the series. So what I expect to present to you today is a little bit about herbaria. You can see my title up there. But really, there's no better place to start than, of course, with the piece that inspired this presentation. This is Woodland Glade by William Trost Richards, 1860 oil on canvas. And in non-COVID situations, in a regular situation, I'd be visiting the Carter to have a look at this specimen. But because I'm minimizing my movements, I was able to utilize the collaboration that the Amon Carter had with Google Arts and Culture. And for this particular piece, among some of their others as well, you can actually find this piece photographed at high resolution so that you can really zoom in, because the photograph that you're looking at on the screen really doesn't do it justice. This landscape, I think we're probably all struck immediately with that profusion of botanical diversity that we see, that fence that delimits that profusion with that sort of pastoral scene, some large trees in the background, and then you can see the mountains in the back. And evidence suggests that Richards was actually in Bethlehem in eastern Pennsylvania, probably right there on the border of Lehigh and Northampton counties. And that's the landscape that he was depicting. You can see a map of that from Google Earth in the bottom left-hand side of my screen. If you're like me, aside from immediately being struck by those profusion, if you're a passionate about plants, you probably started looking at things in here. You probably started paying attention to the fact that there's some ferns there in the foreground. You probably started looking at some of those vines that are climbing up the tree, and you thought, wait, that kind of looks familiar. And that's really what I did. I couldn't help but look at this painting and start to wonder, what is it? What am I looking at? So I hope that throughout this presentation, you'll join me, and as I share the additional spectacles that I put on beyond just passionate about plants and art, but the additional spectacles of a herbarium curator and a botanist. So my immediate questions are, what are these things that I'm looking at? I want to know what they are. Part of botanical training means that you become familiar. You may specialize in a particular group, taxonomic, a group of plants that are related, or you may specialize in an area or a process. But one of the underpinnings of botanical education is an understanding of how these organisms are related to one another, their organization into families, those morphological visible characters that group them into like groups that we use to classify them into like groups. What that means is that a botanist that's familiar with some of the larger cosmopolitan families of plants knows no stranger wherever they go on the globe. And we're imbued with this need whenever looking upon a floristic scene to ask the questions and make the comparisons with our local flora. So I can't help but do that when I'm looking at this. I can see what looks like a Virginia creeper in the bottom left-hand side of my screen right now. I can see some other vines that look like they're up in the left that might be Lonicera, it might be a honeysuckle. I'm also looking at something right around that pool that you see. I'm looking at other slim-leaved plants that might be grasses or sedges or rushes, which all habitate around these kind of pools. And then I'm looking at the other image. I'm looking at these ferns in here. But we have to remember that this piece of art was created in 1860. So even though I can make those jumps and leaps and comparisons with my flora, and I can start to recognize some things in this image, I have to also think back, well, what did this place look like 160 years ago? How do I know that? How do I find out what that looks like? So this next screen is meant to overwhelm you with, this is where my mind goes to answer that question. Each of these is a herbarium specimen that is deposited in one of 10 institutions, 10 herbaria natural history collections around North America. There are about 21 specimens on here, and this is just a small smattering of the potential species that may be in that image. But let's go back, a step back, and have a look at what exactly is a herbarium specimen. So Richards was documenting this landscape with his tools, which was a pen, or rather of oil and canvas. But what I do and what I support and take care of are scientific specimens that look much like the one you're looking at on this screen. Now, herbaria, botanical collections, preserve material in many different ways. This is simply one of them, one of the most common ways to preserve vascular plants and flowering plant specimens, and you're looking at that on the screen. This represents a source of primary data that documents our botanical heritage. These specimens, you'll hear me call them vouchers, they provide evidence for the existence of that documented species in space and time. And there's a quick rundown of the things, the elements that you're seeing on the specimen. First off, at the top, we have the accession stamp. So this particular specimen and all the other specimen images that you're going to be seeing today will have a stamp that denotes the herbarium that cares for and owns this collection. So this collection in particular was deposited in the SMU herbarium, which is now at BRIT. You've got the plant specimen itself, which of course is the most important, one of the two most important parts of this specimen, that is typically glued down, or you can see this particular specimen has some linen straps. Some herbaria actually sew their specimens onto this archival cardstock. Some of the older specimens you'll see were not on archival cardstock. You'll also see a fragment pack, which always makes me wonder and want to open it up to have a look at what's inside, which actually contains all the fragments that perhaps fell off the specimen in the preservation process, or perhaps that contains floral material that a researcher, with permission, sampled from the plant, glued down on the sheet, and then needed to have somewhere to put those elements. And then we have, I'm going to skip down to the bottom one, but we've got the primary label. So the primary label is the other pair to the most important thing on this sheet, the plant specimen and the label. That plant label is what makes this a scientific specimen. It contains the metadata about that collection event, the who, the what, the where, the when. And you'll see some pretty interesting specimens, I hope, in the presentation tonight, hopefully just enough to kind of give you a hint of what kind of treasures I get to be a steward of curators everywhere get to be stewards of. These are objects of scientific research. So the bare elements are that primary label and the specimen itself, but they will be viewed by scientists for hundreds of years. And that viewing, those actions are documented in the form of annotation labels. So in this particular specimen, there's a label that has some red lines on there that says isotype. So this particular annotation label is updating that specimen to say that this is a type specimen of a newly described species. This is the physical specimen that when that scientist published that species, they designated this as the physical example that would accompany that scientific name. This usually represents one of the more important valuable parts of a herbarium collection. So this is the general process. And on the left, specimens are dried flat. Field observations are used to generate those very important labels. On the screen on the far left now, you're able to see a screen capture that I took from iNaturalist, which is a platform for observations about diversity through geotagged photos. It's an incredible resource, a complementary resource to these natural history collections. This particular plant I chose just to show you what that experience is like, to see that plant out in the field, to write those field notes describing the plant. How tall was it? What did it smell like? What did it have a latex or some other colored sap that came out when you broke off a branch? And this particular observation is credited there. You can see this young person who logged this observation. And then after recording those bits of information is the actual collection event of picking the plant or cutting a branch from that tree. And the picture in the middle is actually a relic from my past collaboration with the Amon Carter. And this was part of the Mark Dion exhibit early last year, right before we shut down because of the pandemic. And you'll notice something rather interesting, because I knew that piece was very familiar when Madeline sent it to me. And now I realize why, because if you look in the background of that image, you will see the piece that I am talking about today, the Woodland Glade. And and it's giving me, I didn't want to tell you this, Madeline, earlier, because I thought you'd kind of be excited to see it. What surprises me so much, and which is why I highly recommend that if you're not able to see this piece at the Carter, if you go online to look at that Google Arts and Culture platform to zoom into the images, it is small. It's something like 11 by 7, well, a bit bigger than that, 13 by something or other, 16. So it's rather small. And you'll see in some of the images that follow the level of detail that Richards was able to paint into the piece are incredible. So I apologize, I got a bit derailed, but there, Barney Lipscomb, he's a Lenahart Chair of Texas Botany at BRIT. He works with me. He's my fellow collaborator and mentor, and he actually assisted me with some of the work you'll see later on. But what he has his hand on there is a press. So this is a typical, hasn't changed for a long time, a typical way to press and dry specimens between sheets of newspaper. What you're looking at next to that, you can see sort of aluminum cylinder in there. That's a vasculum. We don't use these any longer, but they were used quite prevalently to collect plants, keep them moist while in the field, and then come back to your place of residence to press and dry them. It's funny, if you have a Google of vasculum and paintings, you'll see that a lot of botanists were pictured with a vasculum strapped around them, drinking a pint in a pub. So I think not much has changed in there. And then, of course, it all culminates in the physical preserved specimen, which is taken care of for and made accessible for the life of that specimen. So hopefully some of you glanced over to the side of the screen and saw the zoom in of that label that I showed you. So this is one of the gems of our collection. And as Madeline was mentioning in the introductions, one of our grants has been to digitize our collection, which I'll get into in a little bit. But this was one of the collections that we discovered, one of the specimens that we discovered in our collection. And if you look in that at that label, at the very bottom, you see the word legit, which is a Latin label to denote the collector. And you'll see that that's a rather famous name. So you'll see that this is a specimen collected by John Muir in Sierra Nevada, California in 1875. And there's a long history about how it ended up getting to BRIT, which one of our staff in the herbarium put together in a blog. So you could probably find it if you pop into the BRIT website over here. So let me double check my notes to make sure I'm not missing anything. So this process really hasn't changed much since the 1500s when these specimens were being generated in this way. They were bound in books, but then separated out. And these specimens exist in herbaria, these natural history collections around the world. So the screenshot you're looking at right now is a map that's available, made available by the New York Botanical Garden through the Index Herbarium, which is a global registry of herbaria that they maintain. This was pulled off there just today. So about 3,000, well, actually, I'm sorry, this is from their 2020 annual report. So about 3,426 active herbaria around the world with 12,000 plus associated professionals with an estimated 396 million specimens. So that's a rather impressive number. But even more impressive is when you look at the estimates for what we don't know about botanical diversity on Earth. It's estimated that about 20% of our world's flora is unnamed. Is unnamed perhaps because it's never been encountered, unnamed perhaps because it lurks within our cabinets, disguised as a common species, mistaken for something else, misidentified. So here's one such example. This is the Philicology Herbarium, which is where I'm employed as the Herbarium Collections Manager. What I hope this screen shows you, well, let me take a step back. For any of you that are signed in right now that may be signing in from another place, we're located in the southern United States, in the state of Texas, a little bit to the north side of Texas. And in the top right hand of the screen, you can actually see our building. I love to show this image because you have a great view of our living roof and you're able to see, not uninterrupted, but you're able to see a living roof with a pocket prairie right behind it. And I'm not sure if Rob's going to be talking about that at all, but that image may come in useful a little later. The herbarium itself and our library collections, or BRIT, are actually in that other portion of the building where you can see sort of a cylindrical solar tubes. But I hope what you're looking at this image is that you're also seeing that these herbaria are centers that centers for innovation, centers for attracting people for shared education and learning about these plants. Almost every person everybody but three people. Well, I'm repeated, or one's repeated. In this image are volunteers. We rely on our volunteers to help with all aspects of the preservation process, from the mounting of the specimens in the middle, the gluing them, affixing them to sheets of the paper, to the collecting of them, as you can see down at the bottom, to the digitization and the measurements that we take for these and the filing of these specimens. Only in a herbarium can you find that a herbarium represents a unique place for you to be able to look at a species across space and time. You may have 500 of a single species and you're able to evaluate it much more minutely to see, well, is this the same as this? And how have these changes, how have these things changed over time? Are there phenological changes? Is it flowering at a different time? So these collections are available. You can make an appointment, you can visit us. We regularly send loans of these specimens around the world to researchers that are doing taxonomic studies, figuring out, well, what is a species? To researchers that may be looking at chemical constituents concentrated in these plants, to perhaps researchers that are looking at symbiotic relationships of fungi that live within the roots of these plants. But the problem is that for the most part, these collections are locked inside cabinets. This is part of the preservation process, keeping them cool, keeping them dry, keeping them airtight, light tight in these spaces, but they're organized into folders as you're looking at there. But the big challenge is that these specimens represent a source of data that hasn't been utilized to its full potential to help us answer some of these questions about how life has changed on Earth and how it might change and what might happen under changing climatic conditions. So the intent is to make these available to the world. One part of this process is digitization. So it's making these collections, making a digital surrogate of these, photographing them at high resolution and putting those images online, which is what you'll see a lot of today, or you've already seen a lot of today. Parse data from those labels. You saw a lot of those older specimens I was showing you have that handwritten data, which makes it really difficult for optical character recognition or other computer technologies to discern that information, much less to parse it out into the appropriate descriptive fields. And then the last step, which is really exciting, which is the geo-referencing. It is taking that geographic locality that's described on the label and putting it into applying geographic coordinates and an associated error to them so that we can envision this in space. Add the aspect of time in there, and you can imagine what a powerful data set you have of images, of specimens to answer these questions. Here's one example of a project in the last sort of 10 years. The National Science Foundation here in the United States has funded this process. And this happens to be the most recent grant that BRIT has received, specific to our area, to Texas and Oklahoma. This is a collaborative proposal that's led by the institutions that you can see the logos for up at the top of the screen. But the idea is that we will be able to mobilize about 2 million specimens collected in Texas and Oklahoma to put these online, make these available and discoverable for research. Because those of you here, Texas and Oklahoma represents an interesting crossroads where the East meets West, and you see a lot of these distributions of species reaching their extents. And as we're looking at these species and their occurrences, where they occur in the world and what kind of conditions they can occur in, those limits at which they occur, those limits in environmental conditions which they can survive through, become really important when we're modeling what these species distributions will look like under changing climate conditions. So this is another collaboration. Everything I've shown you thus far can be only multiplied when you talk about all these natural history collections, not just the plants, but you can imagine the animals, the pathogens, all of these in a place where you can look at how these are interrelated, perhaps tied by that geographic coordinate on there. So this project that I'm putting up here is a project that that took place, oh goodness, a few years ago now, 6-7 years ago now. But it was a wonderful collaboration to show the value of these new and novel collections, herbarium collections. This was a collaboration with many partners, but I'll highlight the first one that I've listed out there, which is the Fort Worth Zoo. So this really started as part of, is when Michael Foraker from the Fort Worth Zoo contacted Amanda Neal, who was the BRIT principal investigator of this project, and said, you know, we're missing the botanical element for a study that we're working with the endemic Jamaican iguana, which you can see pictured on the far right of the screen. These iguanas reside in the Hellshire Hills, which is this rocky limestone karst substrate, this dry evergreen forest that occurs down in the south of Jamaica. But not a lot is known about the botany of the area. This study that was done 7 or so years ago was the most comprehensive study ever done of the area. It added something like 150 species to the species known from the area. Many of them were invasive, new exotic species that had been introduced to the area. Others were simply species that were missed in for earlier studies. But the other very cool thing is we were able to discover some species that are listed by are red listed. So these are known to be endangered species. And I think there were something like at least 50 endemic species that occur only in Jamaica and nowhere else. But the way this all tied interestingly in with the project is that we collected something on the order of 400 specimens, about 1,200 because they were collected in duplicate with collections deposited at 2 herbaria within Jamaica, and the third set coming to BRIT. So we were able to collect these specimens, but every time we encountered fleshy fruit in the Hellshire Hills, we would collect additional material, and we would actually dissect the fruit to expose the seeds so we could see what they would look like. So this was in collaboration with the Fort Worth Zoo, as well as the University of the West Indies, that were collecting scat from these iguanas. So the intent being that with the seed guide and the fruit guide that we were able to produce as part of this project, they were able to analyze the fecal material to figure out, well, what are these iguanas eating, and how can we know what we need to conserve this iguana? So some rather incredible place to work, probably one of the hardest, driest places I've ever had to work. And I had to throw the image on the bottom left in here because this was Byron, who is lead on this project studying the iguanas. He left for the day, and we found that some of our specimens started molding. So the quickest way to remove that mold is to put them in alcohol. So we took a bit of his of the bottles that he had there, and were able to save the specimens. So, and then pictured in the middle is a dear friend and a mentor, is Patrick Lewis, who was their Jamaican collaborator, who really knew the flora so incredibly well, without which the project really couldn't have taken place. So the last few slides here, I want to take us back to the Richards artwork, and I want to show you some of those zoomed in characters that I was referring to earlier. So in the top right hand of the screen, you're actually seeing a zoomed excerpt from, I think it was the middle right hand towards the bottom of the painting. And you can see that there's a specimen in there, a plant that looks like it has parallel veins on its leaves. Now, before I was able to zoom in on it with the image that was online, I could see those leaves. I could see that they were glossy and they were blue, and I could say, I think I know what it is, but there were two candidates for it, and you can see the two of them over here. There's a Solomon seal or false Solomon seal. You can look at these two specimens and you can see that they're somewhat similar. They have that same parallel venation on those leaves, but you'll notice something distinct that a botanist would be paying attention to. Those reproductive characters on those specimens are what help us tell these species apart. And these are in genera, they're not in the same genus, but you can see that this plant has a terminal inflorescence. So the grouping of flowers is up here at the very end of the sets of leaves. When you look at this other specimen, you can see that here are the flowers and they're coming out of the axils of the leaves. So if we take us over to the right-hand image, you can see in this photograph that you actually have these bluish berry clusters right here in the axils of the leaves rather than a kind of a terminal raceme like you see in the other one. So I'm quite convinced that this is the genus Polygonatum, which is the Solomon seals, the true Solomon seals. I don't know for certain which species it is. If it is the species of the specimen that I have up here, then it's native to our area. If it's the other species, then it's an exotic that's been introduced from Eurasia. What about the ferns? They're among the most beautiful specimens. And so these ferns that this is from the bottom center of that image. And you can see I've just put two images of ferns on here. And there are a few other candidates that could be a match for these, what's pictured in the painting. The ostrich fern, that's the one on the left. The wood fern is the Dryopteris there in the middle. And you can see it's quite difficult to discern which it might be, and I've just chosen two candidates out of many more. Ferns are quite special in that, for many reasons, as our fern curator Alejandra Vasco would tell you from BRIT. But the spores, as you can see on the left-hand specimen, can you see those sort of russet shapes on there on the backs of those leaflets of those pinnae? You can actually, those are the methods of reproduction, and those are often quite diagnostic, their placement. But on the specimen I'm looking at, or on the plant I'm looking at in the painting, I can't quite see those. So a lot of the tools that we use to diagnose these plants are reproductive in nature. So when presented with something that's sterile, that doesn't have those reproductive characters, makes it a lot more difficult. Now, I'd forgotten about this, but this image that you're looking at with the ferns, if you peek just below one of those fronds, let's see, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but right below that frond, you can see there's a spike there. Could be purplish, could be white. There's another one here, and I don't think it's the same. It could be, but I don't think it's same because this one is much wider and it has a triangular shape where this looks much more elongate. The painting got many of those things. Which are frustrating because I am not familiar with the flora of the area. So I can't quite tell enough from these images to know what species they might be. So what about the vines? I think you all probably saw the vines in there. Well, I'm quite certain we probably have some grapevines in here, which would have been a part of that floristic composition in the Woodland Glade for us. So I've put in a fox grape on the left in there, although you don't quite see the leaves, but the shape is similar to that image on the bottom right. However, that image holds quite a lot of similarity with the specimen that you can see on the far right. That specimen on the far right is not a grape. It's not the genus Vitis. It's actually the genus Hedera helix, which is English ivy, which is not a plant native to this area. And then in the middle, you can see perhaps a specimen that's familiar to you, our Virginia creeper, which we have quite prolific here in the Fort Worth area. And you can see that one climbing up that bark, that trunk that's available there. So a few questions still left behind. And then you've got this, and this is another genus that you may be familiar with from our area here, the goldenrods, the genus Solidago. And the image on the right, you can probably barely see, but there's sort of an erect stem with these inflorescence branches, these groupings of flowers that are bright yellow. So this is goldenrods are native to our area as well, but it's a bit difficult to tell simply from this specimen which species it is, and there are quite a few goldenrods. So beyond the genus, it's a bit difficult for me to say what it might be. So these are the general conclusions I can draw from having looked at that painting. as a botanist and herbarium curator, that this is probably depicting a landscape scene that's in the late summer, early fall. If you really zoom into the image, you can almost imagine that hazy blue of the perhaps Kittanini Mountains in the back is kind of with maybe leaves starting to change color, perhaps. But for at least my eyes as a botanist that isn't familiar with the flora of this area and the likely composition of this area, the detail, although great, is insufficient for me to tell what species these may be, although I can do, in some cases, generic identifications. The question that I'm left with is this sort of apparent profusion of sort of native diversity and woodland richness an illusion? And I say it that way because as we're looking at this, when I was looking at this painting, I sort of interpreted it to show a woodland scene that is all that is native and natural to this area, that is separated from that fencing with an area that is managed, an area where the trees have been felled for agriculture. This is the Great Valley, so soils rich and fertile. And so my first take of this is that Richard was trying to show that difference. But we know this area to have been settled in the 1700s, and before that by Native Americans to use the land. But the former, the European settlers, really participating in the felling of the forest and the fragmentation of that landscape. And by the mid-1800s, there was enough travel with the seaport not too far away to the east that a lot of exotic species could have been brought over on shipments by people intentionally and unintentionally. So it's not unlikely that this flora, the Woodland Glade flora, does contain some of these exotic species that may have been invasive or perhaps not invasive. So what it all circles down to, and I hope that back and forth that you've heard from me tonight, is that these herbaria and herbarium specimens, these natural history collections, are critical resources. The physical material on the sheet can be sampled for study. But what I haven't talked much about today is are they safeguarded? We hope that these will last for hundreds of years. We need that timeline to answer these big questions we're faced with. But these collections are underfunded in many cases and not safeguarded. It's not been 2017 that we received a collection of 500,000 plant specimens that was the basis for floristic work in Louisiana that was not valued by the university. They weren't able to keep it, and we were able to provide a home for it. But we don't want this. This removed those specimens from the places and the people that needed to study them. So I'll leave you with that thought. And then the last slide, I'd just like to share my, oh, goodness. Are y'all still seeing my slide? Okay, Rob is shaking his head. Let's see.
Yeah, it went black. Oh, there it goes.
All right, perfect. It just advanced without me. So acknowledgements, just a big thank you, Madeline, and to the Amon Carter for the chance to get into this artwork a bit more, for being able to take the time to do so. Certainly to Barney Lipscomb, who's my partner in crime always, and the specimen images, and I'll name these, there are a few, but the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University, Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the Brown University, the Field Museum of Natural History, Pennsylvania State University, Indiana University, Pennsylvania State University, West Virginia University, and the Philicology Herbarium at BRIT. This effort, if you would like to join as a virtual volunteer, you can certainly go to our website and you can visit brit.org/armchairbotanist. And then, because although we're doing many things virtually, the gardens are open, so you can come visit us. And there's just a few of the upcoming events for next week that you're welcome to participate in, and brit.org is the website. And that's it. So thank you for listening to me. Of course, thank you to all of you for being here this evening.
That was so informative, Tiana. Thank you so much. It's like a deep dive into one of the artworks that I have the pleasure of looking at regularly, but had no idea what was represented in the image. So that was wonderful. We have gotten some questions, but we're going to save those for the end. If anybody has questions for Tiana while you're thinking of them, as a reminder, please add them to the Q&A. And I'm keeping track of everything, so we'll try our best to answer those questions after Rob. And with that, Rob.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm hoping that y'all are seeing my screen. Somebody Madeline, if you can give me some indication, please.
Yes, we are.
Looks great.
Thank you. My name is Rob Denkhaus. I'm the director of the Fort Worth Nature Center. And I'm really honored to be able to be a part of this presentation, and especially to follow Tiana. I've known Tiana a long time, and for those of you that don't necessarily know her, that was about half as enthusiastic as she is when she's actually out amongst her plants. And it's a wonderful experience to see somebody that is so knowledgeable and just in love with what they do. And there's lots of folks at BRIT that are like that, as there are at the Nature Center here. It's my honor tonight to talk about what I call the art and science of prairie management. And prairies are a habitat type that I think, well, first off, they are one of the most endangered of all habitats. And I think that they aren't given their fair due amongst the general public. They're oftentimes referred to as a sea of grass, which, if you don't know the natural history side of things, could almost give you the impression of an overgrown lawn. And prairies are much more than that, deserve much more respect than that idea. And I think what I want to do tonight is tell you a little bit about how we at the Nature Center try to manage our prairies and maintain a natural state. So for those that are not familiar with the Fort Worth Nature Center, we're about a 3,600 acre city park managed as a natural area full of prairies and upland cross timbers and bottomland hardwoods, and the West Fork of the Trinity River bisects the property. So we have a little bit of everything that North Texas has to offer. But the prairies are one of the prime things people come to see. And tonight's presentation is inspired by Terry Evans' work, Dune and Swale of Northern Indiana. And this shows a prairie in Northern Indiana. I believe it was outside of Gary, Indiana, which I imagine is probably the city you can see on the horizon in the upper left. And this picture really, as you look at it, it does several things. The mosaic of a number of photos overlaid and interwoven together really tell the story metaphorically of a real prairie. That each of those pictures could be freestanding as an image of prairies, but it isn't until you put them all together that you get the ecological integrity of what a prairie is. And I really like both the inclusion of the city skyline and the hiker that's walking down the trail there, because humans have long been a component of prairie ecology. Going back in North America, the indigenous peoples obviously took advantage of the prairie, utilized its resources, and managed it in their own way back then. The other thing about this is that each individual photo kind of shows you a little microcosm of the prairie. And as you wander about a prairie area, whether you're talking something that's a few acres or hundreds or thousands of acres, it's really a series of microcosms. And so this picture really kind of speaks to a lot of those things. At the Fort Worth Nature Center, we have a number of small prairie sites. That Fort Worth is a prairie town, but we're a different type of prairie than there is in Northern Indiana. This is an area on the Nature Center known as Farview Prairie. And what it does, while looking vastly different than Evan's work, it also shows some of the same things if you start to look at it in pieces. And so if you just kind of focus in where these ovals are appearing, you can see that each of them looks very, very different at this view. And if we could zoom in on each and every one of them, you'd see that individually they are completely different. Now, the reason that they're different is because of different soils and different moisture regimes. The kind of middle oval is on an area that we would refer to as a bench that has totally different moisture levels in the soil than that in the farther or in the foreground or in the background there. And so these things work together, both soils and moisture content work together to create the mosaic of vegetation that makes for a healthy prairie. To drive home that idea of the soil mosaic, which is really where all this begins, this is a Google Earth image of the Nature Center in the orange or red outline, and then overlaid is a soil map. And each of those yellow squiggly lines delineates a soil type, and each number is a different soil type. So you can see how intense the mosaic is, even on a fairly large scale. And if you zoom in, you'll see that it becomes even finer detail. And those small patches of soil are all going to generate different dominant plant communities, especially when you add in the different water regimes that'll be there. And the beauty of it is that with different plant community, each different plant community will have different fauna, whether you're talking butterflies or mammals that take advantage of it. So the prairie as a habitat is a series, a mosaic of different small postage stamp size areas almost that are constantly giving you a different view almost with every step you take. This is a satellite image, again, from Google Earth of an area in the Nature Center we call the Demonstration Prairie. And this is this particular image was taken after the prairie had been mowed, part of our management regime there. But the reason I show it is because of this area here with these blobs of dark green vegetation. Those are woody sumac brush that's growing up in this prairie site. And it really is a story of prairies in nature, that they're constantly fighting a battle to stay a prairie, because nature is constantly trying to change its prairies into forest. Just as the forests are always changing and ponds and lakes are always filling in and becoming dry land through this process we call succession. In prairies, they're always trying to lean towards a forest. And in this case, on this about 17-acre prairie we have, it's trying to become a forest through the encroachment of this native but invasive sumac brush. Now, nature takes care of this battle through natural disturbances. In prairie settings, fire is a very natural disturbance that sets back this succession. Land management is a battle against succession, and the fires, which were in nature lit by lightning strikes for the most part, they would spread and cleanse an area of woody brush and just be like the wildfires that we're seeing in other parts of the country, or we've even had in Texas over the years. Another type of natural disturbance would be grazing. And we're all aware of the herds of bison that frequented the prairies pre-European settlement. And those animals would do tremendous damage to the prairie, aesthetic damage, but actually by doing that damage, disturbing the prairie, they were actually helping to maintain it. And while the ability of a large animal, especially a large herd of large animals like bison, to impact a habitat is pretty obvious, it really comes down to probably the more important herbivory, the grazing that goes on in prairies is actually invertebrates, grasshoppers and such, that are small in size, but many in number and their biomass may actually surpass the large mammals. And their constant grazing can do tremendous work towards setting back succession, which is what we're trying to do in managing prairies. Now, here at the Nature Center, we are fortunate enough to have a small bison herd that are confined on about 210 acres of fenced pasture divided into 5 different paddocks that we rotate them through. And some of their pasture areas are prairie sites, and the bison are used to help manage those prairies. And bison are the perfect species to do this because bison are a keystone species for the prairie habitat. By being a keystone species, it means that they impact not just the prairie itself, but every animal that utilizes the prairie. And in this case, it's both their physical traits and their behavioral traits. Bison obviously graze great quantities of vegetation, which is a good thing. Much like mowing your lawn makes it healthier. Grazing is nature's way of mowing. And so their consumption is helping to stimulate growth of the grasses. If you eat, you defecate, so they're actually fertilizing the soil as they move about. They have behaviors like taking dust baths in wallows that they create, which create little minor topographical features on the landscape. And those will actually hold a little bit more water than the neighboring soils, and can have an entirely different plant community living inside the depression created by a bison wallow, especially because those wallows tend to be used for generations of bison. So, and even the shaggy fur is important because it picks up seeds as they graze and move about in the prairies, and their migrations and movements are going to spread those seeds to new areas, which is confined on the Nature Center to that 210 acres of fenced area, but they're still moving things around, and that improves genetic diversity and biological diversity of the habitat throughout their range. We try to simulate or emulate this same type activity through artificial means. We do a lot of mowing, which in this form, mowing and just leaving the cut vegetation on the ground can be adding organic material back to the soil, which will stimulate plant growth, or if left in a thick layer, may actually dampen the growth of an invasive species because it blocks sunlight to the soil. It's grazing, but leaving the food on the surface there. Oftentimes, though, we actually will bale that cut grass to actually make hay, and we use it to feed our bison herd. But in this case, this is a closer resemblance to the grazing because we're actually removing the vegetation from the area. We're just not producing the fertilizer that goes on top of it that would normally be done with ungulates or herbivores that are frequent in the area. Now, one thing I neglected to mention, one of the beauties of bison as a land manager is that their hooves are designed in such a way that basically every step they take breaks the soil surface just slightly and breaks it up and cuts it, much like those old-fashioned shoes or attachments you could put on your shoes to aerate your lawn with. That allows for moisture absorption and gas exchange to go through. Well, when we bale the hay, the apparatus that actually picks up the cut vegetation is scratching the surface just the same as the bison do. So we're actually helping to aerate the soil while we gather hay. On a side note, managing our prairies through collecting or cutting hay benefits not just the Nature Center and our bison, but we have developed the habit of using it for erosion control on projects that range throughout the city now. that instead of using traditional hydromulching and stuff, there's many areas, mainly within the park department, that are starting to use our native grass hay as a mulch layer over disturbed soils, which helps with plant regeneration there. But our hay that we provide is actually full of native grass and forb seeds. And so we're actually seeding the area at the same time we're mulching it. And a really good example of this would be Chisholm Trail Park and the development that occurred a few years back there, where our hay was used to stimulate the native vegetation's return. And even on the day we dedicated that park, we had a wonderful natural undulating vegetation edge along the brand spanking new concrete walkways. And that was all because of utilizing prairie hay to instead of commercial mulch. But the biggest thing we do, and the showiest thing we do in managing our prairies, is fire. You may have seen that just a couple weeks ago, and Tiana made reference to it, that we burned a piece of the BRIT property there, about 2.5 acres of established prairie that was our first truly urban prescribed fire in Fort Worth, which is a tremendous paradigm shift and a wonderful step forward in the management of natural areas in the city of Fort Worth. And in this fire, which everybody understands the dangers inherent upon it, but used correctly, it's one of the safest, most cost-effective and efficient tools to manage prairies that there is. Let's use a comparison for a land manager. Let's compare that person to a doctor. If you're sick, the doctor looks at your symptoms and your ailments and then prescribes a treatment. A land manager looks at a prairie and looks at the symptoms, whether that is, maybe there's too much standing vegetation and there isn't enough sun able to reach the soil surface for seed germination, or maybe it's an influx of invasive species, woody brush or something like that. Those are the ailments, and the land manager/doctor will diagnose that and prescribe a treatment. Sometimes that treatment will be fire, and the fire can be dosed in various ways. The fire you see here in this photo, the gentleman is lighting the head fire, which burns with the wind, and it looks very intense, but actually is one of the less intense types of fire because it moves quickly. And so this fire is a good cleansing fire, but it's not a killing fire, killing trees and shrubs that you may want to wipe out of the prairie. In that case, you would use a backfire, which burns into the wind, burns much slower, but actually sends heat down into the soil that kills seeds and roots and such. So we use fire on a regular basis, and we're all familiar with the concept of fire. We see it on the news, and I want to show you a little piece here, a video that just to give you an idea of what the fire is like. This is on an area we call Alice Ashley Savannah, and this would be a head fire moving towards us. You can see the intensity, and as it hits different kinds of fuels, the fire changes. When it hits that dry woody brush there, it flares up, and it's very intense. But the burn manager is going to prescribe the different ways to control it, and it's amazing how little effort is needed to stop a well-planned fire. So we do this very, very safely. Now, it does result in a charred area, but here is a photo of a prairie that this picture was taken roughly 2 weeks after the fire had gone through. We burned this area in July of that same year, and you see that it's already greening up. And there you can see the burnt little blue stem clumps that are still there. But up in amongst all that, we have new green vegetation coming up. And you very quickly see the deer and other wildlife coming in to take advantage of this lush growth. Appropriately and periodically. If you remember the 2011 wildfire year that we had in Texas, with many of the state parks and such having catastrophic wildfires, the ones that had utilized prescribed fire to manage their areas prior did not suffer nearly the catastrophic damage that those that had prevented fire from being. Point of a burn or in the management, we frequently will come in and add seed to it utilizing a native seed drill. When you look at the seeds of native plants, they aren't necessarily all the same. Like if you were planting a Bermuda grass lawn or something. And so these seed drills are rather specialized and can handle large seeds, small seeds, fluffy seeds, hard seeds, all the different options that are out there in the native seed world. And we can actually increase the diversity of vegetation or increase the density of vegetation through active seeding of the properties. So we utilize all these techniques to manage our prairies in a variety of ways. And each prairie gets managed in a slightly different manner and a different schedule. And because we also have to factor in the human element, that we have 60,000 plus visitors annually coming out, and we don't want to have the entire place burned to a crisp when they visit. So everything's on a nice rotation, trying to emulate the natural fire regime or hay cutting regime. And like an area like this Demonstration Prairie right here, that in a 5-year cycle, this will be cut for hay 2 or 3 times, left fallow and then burned and then repeat. And it is something that we learn as we do, and we are constantly striving to get better at it. And as we gain new knowledge and through climate change and other dynamic situations that our prairies change, we are opportunistic to try new techniques and explore new options. And I hope that y'all have some interesting questions for us.
We have gotten a couple. Rob, it looks like your camera may have frozen on you, but we hear you just fine.
Let me see what I can do here.
If it doesn't work, don't worry about it, since we're coming to the end anyway. But I just wanted to let you know. Yes, this was so informative. I feel like I kind of understand what was going on in Fort Worth the other week with the. I was definitely surprised with the prescribed burns. One of our viewers this evening said the same thing, that she lives in Arlington Heights, and everybody had lots of questions on next door. And she was like, let us know next time, and I'll warn them. But one of the questions we got, I'll let Rob get a drink of water too, and start with you, Tiana, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
Jenny asked, how do you determine the real life size of the plants in the painting?
That is such a great question, Jenny. And actually, I have to say that it was more relative size than anything. And it was such a realistic picture that you could really see the depth in there and imagine how far apart some of those were. So it was really mostly relative size to objects, to plants that I knew the size of, if that helps. So I was able to kind of place my little keystones in there, and then from that infer the size of some of the others. However, you are totally correct. The size is very diagnostic for many of those species. So beyond level of genus, having a scale would have been great.
I think as Rob is trying to figure out his camera, we'll keep going with you. Shauna Cisneros had a really great question. She said, the vine that was in the lower left quadrant of the William Trust Richards painting looks like a vine she had on her pecan tree in the backyard. And you mentioned that it was, your thoughts were that it was a vine that also may grow around town. She noted that it was a very strong vine and she could barely kill it.
Yeah, actually, so that specimen, or that vine, if it's the one I think you're talking about, I believe to be Virginia creeper. So this is a plant that we have prevalent in this area. It also grows with poison ivy, another vine, as well as grapes. We have those three genera: Toxicodendron, Parthenocissus, and what was the last one that I mentioned? Vitis, all here in this area. So it's likely that it was Virginia creeper, but most certainly one of the services we do provide is identification services. So you are certainly welcome to submit material to us, but I would encourage you to investigate the iNaturalist platform that I mentioned in my presentation. And somebody on the chat actually talked about iNaturalist as well. It has some pretty incredible image analysis algorithms that will help you identify what you are photographing. So it has some pretty incredible things that will help do that. But beyond that, it is adding to accumulated data about these species in a much faster way than herbarium specimens accumulate, in a much less extractive way. So I would encourage you to explore iNaturalist. But otherwise, you can certainly send me an email or look on the BRIT website, and we'll identify your plants for you. We love to do that.
Yes, and that's such a great note. Mary Morrow mentioned that you can use that iNaturalist.org for identification, and that there's also several great Facebook groups that help with IDing plants. But you should definitely take advantage of a local connection, and they'll know the plants better than anybody on the internet. I can imagine. Rob, you were able to get back. I'm so excited.
Sorry about that. Technology got the best of me.
Technology happens to all of us. While you're here, Dorothy asked a really great question. Going to the controlled burns. She asked if the public is able to view the next one, if there is one planned, I guess I should say.
Well, first off, I'm going to ask a great favor of everyone here to never use the phrase controlled burn. The only the BRIT fire from 2 weeks ago is now a controlled burn. It's out. It's not going anywhere. Anybody that ever has lit a fire does not want to ever talk about a controlled burn until the fire is out. In the meantime, we call it a prescribed fire. The public, like at the BRIT fire there, the public could have been around to witness that. You certainly from any distance can watch the smoke. When we burn at the Nature Center, we don't advertise that we're doing it, but we don't really keep anybody from witnessing it either. Honestly, when we're burning, we certainly don't want to have a couple thousand people gathered around that we have to worry about that layer of hazard as well. But we've had many of folks witness our fires. And so it's kind of a hit and miss. You happen to get lucky and see it. You have to understand that it is a highly dangerous activity that we're doing. So please forgive us for not making it a big public event.
No, that totally makes sense. On that topic, you did mention the way that the team managed the fire and made sure that it wasn't, that it was prescribed correctly and was controlled in the right fashion. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Jenny, who's been watching, has asked if you could.
There's a complete science in using fire, and part of the prescription, to use the doctor metaphor some more, that a doctor is not going to just tell you what medicine to use and not give you a clue about how much to take, when to take it, and all those kind of things. So when the land manager says we're going to use fire here, you're going to say what kind of fire, whether it is that head fire or back fire and those kind of things. But it's also going to say we're going to do it on a day that has a wind speed of 15 miles an hour from the south, because that's going to say where our wind is going to take our smoke. So smoke management is actually much more difficult than the fire management. Fire is pretty predictable. Smoke is not, because winds will change on you. And so when we are looking at prescribing fire, we're picking winds, we're picking temperatures, we're picking moisture content of the soil, of the fuel itself, and the different fuel types. As you can see in that little short video clip, grass burns vastly different than woody vegetation, and things that you don't even think about, things like greenbrier, which is virtually in every tree in the woods around here, has an oil content that makes it go up like you just soaked it in gasoline. And so every little piece of it has to be looked at and factored into the way that you do it.
That is such a great question, and I definitely want to do some more research on my own to learn more about this. Let's see. Tiana, we have a question about, let's see, where is it? From Thomas Hollingsworth. He asked, I noticed in the map of herbariums that Canada, Russia, and Australia seem to have a low representation. Do some herbariums collect from other countries to establish some documentation of other regions?
That's such an excellent question, and I didn't have time to get into some of that aspect. So, Thomas, I'm really glad you asked it. Yes, certainly. Herbaria will collect in other countries. Today, those are governed by collaboratives, documented collaborations, which include all the necessary permits for the collecting, the felling, the extraction, and the movement of that material across international borders in accordance with USDA or their local permits or CITES Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. So that's how we do it now. And there's lots of, it's a lot more difficult perhaps to do field work these days with some of those restrictions in place, but a necessary one and a response in this, especially in the last year, but well beyond that as well. Curators have been looking at their collections and looking at the decolonization of those collections. These colonies, some of these larger herbaria were the epicenters of sending botanists out around the world to extract and collect material and bring it back. And so that's something that herbarium curators are facing today, not just in the botanical and the natural history world, but in the art world as well. So I'd love to hear your comments about it as well, Madeline.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. I just don't know enough to be able to feel like I can answer correctly, to be completely honest.
But I think, and that's part of what we're working through now, is what does that mean? How do we go through this process of decolonizing our collections? How do we make sure that credit is given where it's due, that those records are returned or in some other way repatriated? That's one of the early projects to digitize herbarium collections was the Global Plants Initiative, which is a fantastic project to digitize the world's type collections, which I referred to briefly in my presentation as being the specimens that are paired with a scientific name when that species is first described. So the Mellon Foundation supported the Global Plants Initiative to digitize these herbarium specimens, no matter where they were in the world, and make those available to the countries in which those specimens were collected, and by all other users that needed access to those records. So that's one step in the right direction. So I think through digitization, we can approach an answer to some of that. But also, the other part of your question was looking at the low density of some of those collections in those countries. May also just be a concentration of some of those botanical centers in which their collections are being concentrated at national herbaria. So you might be seeing a bit of that in the bias as well.
Yeah, and something I want to just take a quick second to plug, because I completely agree that to help with the decolonization of these institutions, digitization makes a huge impact. And just last week, the Carter launched digitization of our collection. So now when you're on our website, you can actually type in artworks that we have and see great quality images and details of when that artwork was made and information about the artist. It's a really incredible resource that I'm just becoming familiar with now after working at the Amon Carter for 2.5 years, having this access to every artwork we have in our collection at my fingertips. It's incredible, and it's definitely going to change how we, just as our institution, goes forward in programming and all of the different ways that we do things at the museum, let alone how our community interacts with that collection as well. Okay, let's see. What other questions? Jean Mason had a great question for Rob about how frequently do you mow the prairie?
All land management techniques are based upon whatever your goals and objectives of your management are. So if we're trying to actually eliminate or at least reduce an invasive species, we may mow much more frequently. If we're just trying to do kind of a healthy mowing, then we'll just do it annually, and usually in the winter, where we still can harvest hay for our bison and for our mulching projects that we work with and things like that. So it really depends on what you're trying to do.
Great. That's wonderful. Let's see. Barbara Wyatt asked a great question for Tiana. I'm kind of going back and forth between you two. Some artists depict foliage which would never be growing together in the artwork that they've painted. Could all of these botanicals have been growing together in the same spot as is depicted? And you kind of touched on this, but Barbara brings up a great question about the artistic license. What are your thoughts, Tiana?
That's so great, actually, Barbara. And the answer is that I can't answer your question because I can't really tell what is what in that image. I believe from the little research I've done that he was known for his realistic renderings. So, and I've seen through Googling some other of his botanical explorations, some sketches. So I feel like there's a faithfulness there to what he was observing. So in this particular case, I expect that, yes, from what I can tell, yes, this is an assemblage you are likely to find existing in nature. But without really being able to identify some of those things, I don't know. I really don't know.
If I may say, Tiana, because that's a little bit more back in my home stomping ground region where I'm from, that picture just looks like the woods up there, and the plants that you identified, Solomon seal and those kind of things, that's all stuff that is common there. Whether it was Virginia creeper or English ivy, well, English ivy is the Johnson grass of the Northwood or the Midwest woods, and so that could very well be there as well.
I'm so glad you said that, and it's such an interesting thing. Is that you're not only adding what are these things, but you're adding that temporal aspect to it. And as I was listening to you, Rob, I just have such respect for your job, because you are dealing with a living, breathing, changing ecosystem and finding the path to best maintain that. How do we know what it used to look like? How do we know what it should be? Navigating that path is a constantly changing, and especially when you throw in all the additions of the fact that the Nature Center is 20 minutes from downtown Fort Worth. All the difficulties into managing that are just astounding. And I am so thankful that I have a brown thumb and I'm dealing with moments in time that I can preserve and manage and control to some extent. So maybe that's the control freak in me coming out a bit. But I think that it's in combination with this knowing and this observations of the land that Rob was talking about, being able to observe these processes and seeing how they naturally are moving. But also having that rich history, those historical data, not just the specimens which vouch for a single plant, a single organism, but also the archives that join those into a picture of what that landscape looked like, those writings, the journals. But beyond that, artworks like this one, artworks that give you an idea of what that assemblage of species looked like. If you look at some of those older collections, a lot of them were collected by individuals for their own gratification. Sometimes they had a patron, and they often exchanged them across to other botanists, but they were collecting them with minimal data. If you look at the amount of data collected on some of those labels that were collected in the 1800s, and you compare those to the labels collected today, I mean, we are dealing with a lot more data-rich specimens today. So we have to infer from so many different sources what the past looked like. And you're trying to manage that in a fragmented, urbanized landscape. So it's just there's no way we can answer the questions we need to answer with any one silver sword. We need all these different disciplines coming together. And I enjoy, the Fort Worth Nature Center was my stomping ground. That's where I learned the flora of Texas, thanks to Rob and Michelle and Suzanne, who are out there, and Bob O'Kinnon. And I highly recommend, if you haven't been out there, it is a gem of a place and something to be modeled.
Yeah, and I just want to take a quick second, Tiana, to mention the diaries and journals that you and the crew at BRIT have sifted through for our Mark Dion exhibition that was interrupted because of COVID and reopened and extended back in June. But looking through some of those written diaries and journals of the Texas pioneers and people who really traveled through our state before it was a state, before it was super industrialized and urbanized, are really rich resources for being able to connect to what the land was before millions of us took over. All right, let's see. I think we have time for one more question. And I am really excited to hear about the answer to this. Harvey Met asked, what role do armadillos play in the prairie ecosystem at the Fort Worth Nature Center? And I love armadillos, so I am so excited to hear about this answer.
I guess that one's directed to me.
I mean, it could go for both. I don't know. Tiana might be an armadillo expert as well.
Well, first off, armadillos are a pretty generalist species, so they belong in our forest as well as our prairies. I referenced a couple of times about bison and the value they have in terms of cutting the soil surface. And armadillos do that to an extreme with their burrowing, and so I actually allow water infiltration at great levels in various spots. And they also, and I'm going to switch species, but it's different but the same. Prairie dogs would be another keystone species for prairies, because they are actually turning the soil over at the rate of, I believe it's about an inch of subsurface soil brought to the surface every decade or so. And that's over acreage, massive acreages of entire prairie dog towns. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but how much time do you spend in your garden turning your soil over to make sure that your nutrients are spread throughout it, and you break up the solidness of the clumps and all those kind of things that animals are doing it for us. And armadillos are doing the same thing there by bringing that subsurface soil up and depositing it on the top. And so it's keeping everything enriched and healthy, maintaining ecological integrity, which if I had to have a catchphrase for everything I've been trying to say, that's what we're trying to do, ecological integrity.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show how important every little living creature and living thing in our environment is to maintaining it and keeping it healthy. And it's great to learn more about what we can do, who we can support, both of these organizations, and to continue the health of our little ecosystem here in Fort Worth. Well, thank you, Tiana and Rob, so much for joining us this evening. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I know there were a couple that we didn't get to, and I'm really sorry, but such is life. If you have a few moments, though, tonight before you sign off, I would very much appreciate you taking a couple of minutes of your time to fill out a survey for us. I'm going to post it in the chat for everyone right now. Here you go. This is a 2-minute survey, and it'll provide us with some information about you and what you would like to see more of from the Carter. Your feedback will help us gain future programming and potentially acquire grant funding as well. So, like I said, I put the link in the chat, and if you will also receive an email with the link tomorrow morning. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to give us your feedback and let us know more about you. So thanks again, Tiana and Rob, and I wish that we were in person this evening, but this was great, and it was so lovely to talk to the two of you about 2 artworks in our collection and the awesome stuff that you guys are doing for our community.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great night, everyone, and we hope to see you again at another program at the Carter virtually in the future. Have a nice evening.
You too.
Right.